Hi, I'm Dr. Kyle Schiefelbein-Guerrero, the Steck-Miller Assistant Professor of Worship and Liturgy at United Lutheran Seminary. This is the first video in a series I'm calling Living the Liturgical Year. Specifically, this series looks at the annual cycle of liturgical seasons and their history and theology, on how that can inform our contemporary practices of liturgical time, especially as we're having to adapt to worship online, worship in the home, worship in the midst of the pandemic. This first video begins where the liturgical year begins, with the season of Advent, looking specifically at where does Advent come from and how does that help us figure out what to do with Advent in 2020. Let's begin first with looking at the advent of Advent. How did it show up in our liturgical calendar? Advent comes from the Latin adventus, meaning to come. And even though currently it is the beginning of the liturgical year, it is actually the last season historically to develop. We have some evidence of it around the time of Pope Gregory I in the late 6th, early 7th century. And we also see periods of preparation or periods of a penitential season in other places in the 5th to 6th century. One possible influence helps establish a parallel between Advent and Lent, and that is as a period of baptismal preparation, usually in that case a 3-week baptismal preparation for those who would be baptized at Epiphany. Later in this series we'll take a look at the origins of Lent and see that Lent originates also with a 3-week intense preparation for those to be baptized at Easter. The areas of Spain and Milan in Italy knew of a 6-week Advent, a 6-week preparation for Christmas. And Gaul knew of it as a St. Martin's Lent because Advent began on St. Martin's Day, November 11th, and it would last for a period of 40 days. And so in there, we see a specific connection between Advent and Lent. Even though we currently place Advent at the beginning of the liturgical year, Roman lectionaries in the 7th century still understood Christmas with the birth of Christ as what began the lectionary and the liturgical year. We see this tension about, is Advent about beginnings or is it about endings when we take a look at the current lectionary in the Revised Common Lectionary, which brings together these multiple layers of the meanings of Advent. So these layers of Advent evolve in various locales because of influence, and will eventually come together in the medieval period. So in Spain and in Gaul, we see Advent evolving as a penitential season, and this seems to be because of Irish influence with the very penitential character to Irish Christianity. In Milan, Advent was seen as the coming of Christ at Christmas, and in our popular understandings of Advent today as the pre-Christmas season, that certainly has won the day. In Rome, Advent is about the parousia, or the second coming of Christ. And therefore, as I mentioned, Rome placed Christmas at the beginning of the liturgical year. Advent was at the end of the liturgical year. So the Milanese approach would certainly place Advent at the beginning of the liturgical year. The Roman approach would place it at the end. And in Spain and Gaul, because it is a penitential season like Lent, it would just appear as a preparation for another season. The medieval theologian and mystic Bernard of Clairvaux helps us understand what these three approaches to Advent actually are, and he does this in one of his own sermons on Advent. He writes, "We know that there are three comings of the Lord. The third lies between the other two. It is invisible, while the other two are visible. In the first coming he was seen on earth, dwelling among humans. He himself testifies that they saw him and hated him. In the final coming, all flesh will see the salvation of our God, and they will look on him whom they pierced. The intermediate coming is a hidden one. In it only the elect see the Lord within their own selves, and they are saved. In his first coming, our Lord came in our flesh and in our weakness. In this middle coming, he comes in spirit and power. In the final coming, he will be seen in glory and majesty. Because this middle coming lies between the other two, it is like a road on which we travel from the first coming to the last. In the first, Christ was our redemption. In the last, he will appear as our life. In the middle coming, he is our rest and our consolation." So here we see these three comings. Christ coming on earth in the incarnation as we celebrate at Christmas. Christ coming again in the end at the parousia, which actually we celebrate during the season of November, culminating on Christ the King Sunday. And really that middle coming of being our rest and our consolation is actually Christ coming to us throughout the rest of the liturgical year, where we learn who Jesus is for us, and we receive Jesus both through word and sacrament. One of the practical things that we do during the season of Advent is light the Advent wreath. Customarily, the Advent wreath is a circle of evergreen with 4 candles, as you can see in the diagram up above right here. The actual origins of the Advent wreath are uncertain, but we know, as we will see when talking about Christmas and the Christmas tree, it was a pagan custom to bring evergreens into the house during winter as a way to capture life and to capture that ever verdant understanding of creation. The popularity of the Advent wreath grows in the 17th century as a ritual at home. So it was originally a domestic ritual, something you would do with your family. And it's much later, probably into the 19th century, that the Advent wreath, as we know it today, is brought into communal worship. The idea of lighting candles in a sequence is about the passage of time, which is why you light 1 candle on the first Sunday of Advent, you light 2 candles on the second, and so on and so forth. Specific stories associated with the candles, or labeling each candle, as is sometimes the practice of faith, hope, love, and joy, is a recent practice. And it can distract us from the idea of candles and the wearing down of the candle as a way to mark the passage of time. If we think about it in terms of the solar calendar, as the days grow shorter toward the winter solstice, we are lighting more and more candles. So that idea of the increase in the brightness of more candles leading to Christ the light on Christmas, that is really the primary theological understanding of the Advent wreath. So for those congregations that are continuing to engage in online worship because of the pandemic, what are some things we can do about the Advent wreath in our online worship. And this works if you're using Zoom or another video conferencing platform, or if you're pre-recording worship or doing live stream if you have a multi-feed system where you can show more than one video at a time. I would suggest having a video feed on the Advent wreath during the entire liturgy. In that way, even if it is just in the corner of the main video, we get that sense of the marking of time. If it is your congregation's custom to light the Advent wreath before the liturgy and just to have it there without any other ritual action, continue to do that. If it's your congregation's custom to have a ritual during the liturgy of the lighting of the Advent wreath and saying a prayer, you will need to find ways of doing that online. You would, at the same time, because of that connection to the Advent wreath being primarily a domestic or home ritual that later comes into the church, encourage your worshipers to make their own Advent wreaths, or even if they don't have a wreath like you see on the screen here, if they just have 4 candles. And if it's the congregation's custom to have the Advent wreath lighted before the liturgy, have the worshipers do that before the liturgy starts, or have them do it simultaneously when the Advent wreath is lighted online. And again, this helps us make those connections between what happens in church on Sunday, either in the building or displaced when we're online, and what happens in the home, what happens in the everyday living of Christians and the living of the liturgical year. So that home wreath, you can create it as a wreath. You can go and buy yourself a Christmas wreath somewhere from a local organization that is selling them as a fundraiser. Or you don't even need a wreath. As you see on the image here, you just have 4 candles. And use regular candles. The idea of having blue candles or 3 purple, 1 pink, the coloring scheme of Advent comes in the medieval period, but primarily the candles have always been white, just like the candles on the altar and the candles at the lectern. These are the same type of candles. Decorate it as a family. If you have candles, you may use ribbons, provided that the candle doesn't burn down too far and the ribbon catches on fire, or a wreath. Sometimes you'll see a log that has 4 holes drilled in it to place in candles. Again, the idea is about marking time, so the wreath shape isn't as important as the fact that the candles are sequential. Like I mentioned on the previous slide, light it in conjunction with online worship each Sunday. You may also think about lighting it each day during the week and creating a home ritual with maybe reading the prayer of the day from that Sunday, that stir up your power, Lord Christ, and come, those exite prayers that you see in the book. And then use the daily lectionary as a way of having your time going from that parousia understanding of the coming of Christ to the announcement of Christ from John the Baptist, to Mary's song about being the mother of God, to the events right prior to the birth of Jesus.